So good evening, everybody. On behalf of CUTS International, let me welcome you to this webinar on transforming logistics performance in BBIN countries. By BBIN, we mean Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal, this sub-regional group. A special welcome to our friends and colleagues from Bangladesh, today being the Victory Day, Vijay Divas, the 50th anniversary, which we are observing and celebrating. Now, coming to the subject, you know that some of you would know, I'm sure all of you would know. I have been hearing this for the last 25 years, that South Asia is least integrated region of the world. And from there also BBIN is one of the least integrated regions of the world. And the reason is that we do very little trade with each other. Now, I don't buy this argument, the reasoning part, not the proposition part. But the simple reason, if you look at the economies, the total size of the economies of these countries, Bangladesh is about $320 billion in 2020, Nepal is about 33, Bhutan is about 3. So taken together, $354 billion. But the size of the Indian economy is about $3 trillion. Of course, the COVID is going to have an impact on most of us in the size of our economy this year, if not all of us. But the question is, how can we have more trade in terms of its volume when there is this imbalance? And we can't do much about it. Of course, there is a lot of potential and we should strive for that potential. But the larger question remains that how much that Bhutan or Nepal or even Bangladesh can import from India, given the size and requirement. Of course, India can import more, which India is doing, and is going to do it consistently over time going forward. But I still think it is least integrated because the cost of doing trade among ourselves is very, very high. Our best trading partner is Germany. In fact, somebody I was hearing the other day that estimated that it is easier for us to do trade with Brazil than Bangladesh. And one of the reasons why this cost of doing trade is high is because our logistics is not that good. So we have been making several efforts for improving our logistic performance. But at the same time, we have to see to it that not just we have to make more efforts, but we have to look for new approaches. So today in our webinar, we are going to discuss one of those new approaches, taking them together, which is corridor fluidity, so as to say, to understand logistic performance in BBIN countries. This is part of a project which we are implementing along with our partners in Bangladesh, Unnayan Samanway, in Bhutan Media and Communications Institute, in Nepal with Nepal Economic Forum. I am very pleased to see that all of them have joined this program. And this is supported by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom, which is previously known as the Department for International Development. And in this project, we are looking at multimodal connectivity between and among these countries, this sub-regional group. So these are the several new concepts which are coming up as we move forward in this work, including the other day. I guess Cecile would remember, I heard a new term, synchro model or synchro model, which essentially means that, if I may put it very loosely or simply, is that of such locations where two or more modes of connectivity can converge. Incidentally, there are a number of such locations in this sub-region. I'm not going to the details of them because some of them may sound Latin or Greek or Hebrew to some of you, but we have identified those locations. where this new concept can be tested. So on that note, we have prepared a discussion paper which which has been circulated. It is written by one of our foremost trade facilitation and logistic experts, not just in India, I would say in the world, Dr. PRITAM BANERJEE, who has joined us. He is going to make a presentation. Following that, I'm going to come to the panel. We have an excellent panel today. I'm sure that we are going to have some great discussion. We have Cecile FRUMAN from the World Bank. We have HOFFMANN from UNCTAD and KUANCHENG from Asian Development Bank. Let me also say that the Asian Development Bank, the transport division, is a knowledge partner of this project, and we have been receiving excellent inputs, guidance from KUANCHENG as we take forward these initiatives. So without any further ado, my 5 minutes is up. So I would request Dr. BANERJEE, PRITAM, to make his presentation. So over to you, PRITAM, in about 15 minutes.
Sure, Bipul, thank you very much. I would like to, as the presentation is being put up on the screen, like to first of all thank Mr. BIPUL CHATTERJEE for his very, very kind and extremely generous words of introduction. And I am really, gratified for, being asked to write this paper, have a platform to share my ideas, and really overwhelmed by the sheer quality and the distinguished panelists as well as the people attending this e-meeting. I would like to say at the very outset that the discussion paper was precisely as the word suggests, a, a way to start a discussion. I'm not saying what is written in the paper is the right way forward. It's just a way to kind of start thinking a little bit differently about how we do things, especially in this region. So with those words, if I may request if we can go to the first slide. Uh, so, over the last 2 decades, the first slide is, yeah, thank you. Over the last 2 decades, if you look at a very large number of reports that have been produced by multilateral agencies, by different aid organizations, by research institutes in the region itself, and we see, if you what we broadly define as trade facilitation and logistics assessment kind of studies, we would typically come to four approaches, give and take a few. The first one would cover perception-based surveys, typically targeting either export-import related stakeholders or logistics supply providers. They might have a national focus or they might look at a specific corridor, but they're basically perception-based surveys asking people about what they feel about logistics quality, transit time, etc. The second approach has been what we call field surveys. Typically, you go to a specific location, you meet local stakeholders, try to get a sense of what the problems are, perhaps even observe some operational aspects of what's happening. Typically, these have been targeted at border points, or ports or airports, gateways or border points. The third one is looking at more detailed process mapping. So you go end-to-end process mapping of a specific set of operational aspects, and you analyze what the challenges are. And typical examples of this are time release studies, which many customs administrations implement, or dwell time studies. In fact, Indian Customs is now conducting regular time release studies across ports, airports, and land ports in India now. And then you have some examples of what we call transit time analysis. So you look at the transit time between a specific origin destination pair. So these kind of broadly covers the methodological approaches we typically seem to have used. Now, in my mind, and I stand to be corrected, repeated application of these same approaches is giving us diminishing returns, because they are giving us the same results, they're giving us the same insights, they're identifying the same problems. And I'm not saying that is not important. I mean, the fact that the same problems are recurring over 2 decades means they have not been addressed. So that itself is an important insight. But I think there are many more issues that lie in between, which are not being perhaps observed or identified because we are not using a new way to look at things. And I'll just use one example, and I say this in many forums, that arguably the land port Benapole Petrapole between India and Bangladesh is arguably the most studied land border in the world. There have been so many studies around this specific location over the last 2 decades. I think there are about 6 in the last decade itself that I know of. And when I read these reports, it's like deja vu. It's like I've read this before as well. So given that situation, is there something else that we can do? So that's the motivation really for this paper. So if I can go to the next slide, please. So the concept of this fluidity of corridors is not really new. It's been there for a while, at least 2 decades that I'm aware of. It kind of got a fillip about, I think, 5 to 6 years ago when the Federal Highway Authority in the United States and the Transportation Research Bureau, or TRB, with support from the Texas A&M University's Transportation Institute, put together a workshop in Washington, D.C. to formalize some of these, these approaches and actually apply them to the American context. And the Canadian government has now also adopted some of these things. And it basically, it's a very simple concept. It essentially refers to the fact that if you look at a specific geography, you have a number of freight, networks that service this specific geography, and there are different modes across different modes. And you basically observe and tabulate specific performance metrics around these freight networks. And that's the way you measure the overall efficiency of that freight network end to end. And the beauty of it is that they don't have to be always performance metrics associated with the physical operation of logistics. It could also cover many of the other areas we think important, like the border effect. So how long does it take to clear goods, etc., at the border? So it can be a comprehensive end-to-end measurement, and that would perhaps give us a better idea. So at this point in my mind, and again I stand to be corrected, we are over focused on the choke points. Now choke points don't become choke points just like that. There's a reason why things end up there and it becomes a choke point. So unless and until we have that end-to-end visibility, we are not doing full justice to our analysis of these problems. And in my mind, as the first step, this kind of a comprehensive identification of what the problems are is the first step towards creating the kind of solution frameworks we need to address these problems. So next slide, please. I can come back to that somewhat complicated looking diagram. Is not complicated at all. I mean, what that basically is trying to tell you in a pictorial format is that you have a set of origin destination pairs. That's your y-axis. Maybe we can go back to the previous slide. I should have talked about it at that point. And then you have in the x-axis basically your choice of modes, and they can be a single mode or a combination. So many times goods move in more than one mode. In fact, everything is multimodal because the first and last mile typically is done by road, even if you're using air or sea or whatever else. And your z-axis essentially is any conditionality that you put on it. It might be are you using containers to move it? Is it moving it off peak time or peak time, whatever. So all the performance kind of stuff can come in there. So every cube in that diagram is a combination of the three, and then you look at specific performance parameters for every cube, and that's what the next slide does. So if we can move to the next slide. So this list is again my list that I have kind of gathered from the literature I'm aware of, and you can add, I think, other stuff to it as well. But I hope it covers more or less largely what you would like to cover when you look at an overall logistics quality, performance of logistics quality. So you have the connectivity and transit time kind of pillar, which looks at connectivity and mobility. Connectivity essentially will look at whether or not you actually have the physical basis between a origin and destination to use a specific mode. Does that exist physically or not? Mobility would refer to the fact that whether or not you have a service, logistics service that gives you a regular service across that particular origin destination pair. Regulatory bottlenecks refer to, for example, your border effect, customs clearance, etc. Reliability is related to transit time commitment. Is it being met? What's the variability in transit time? In different periods for that origin destination pair. Damage and loss is self-explanatory. You have significant damage and loss to cargo when you use that specific origin destination pair. Resilience is a very important factor which we often do not take into consideration. Very vital for South Asia, even in our domestic logistics within India. And if you think of the subcontinent, if you imagine out of the box and you remove the borders, it's essentially one large land mass across which things move. So all of this entire region is very badly impacted. There's huge disruptions that happen. So resilience essentially refers to the fact how able are these freight networks in dealing with disruptions, whether they are due to natural calamities or conditions, or as we have seen, due to pandemics, for example. And robustness refers to the fact that you have the ability of logistics supply providers to respond and deal with the disruption. Rapidity will be the parameters related to how quickly they can come up with an alternative. Redundancy basically means to what extent you actually have alternatives in terms of physical infrastructure to provide you that kind of alternative. You can even look at costs. So you could look at overall costs. You can compare it to a benchmark and say, okay, if as BIPUL was saying, if the cost for me to send a TEU to Germany from India is X, what is it to send it to Dhaka from Delhi? So that's your benchmark. And you can look at economies of scale. It's a very important point that we often miss, and it's part of the discussion that we often miss, is that the basic argumentation is that obviously when you have the networks where there is not much of volume, you will typically tend to have higher prices. It's just typically a good rule of thumb. And as economies of scale increase, the costs fall. But that's not always true in all freight networks, and you have persistently high costs. And one of the things which I have seen in these reports that have come out from various multilateral organizations is that we have always flagged high costs in our networks, in many of our networks, but the volumes have consistently gone up. So if my costs have not gone down by substantially, or by even an X%, while my volumes have gone up 5x or 6x, something is happening here which is unexplained. Maybe there's a very good commercial reason for it, but I need to deep dive to understand what that is. So these kind of factors are not covered in the current analysis that we have. So what's my solution, which might be simplistic, and it's in the next slide. So if we can go to that. So if we can look at this fluidity concept and implement this, and why I think it's easy, coming from industry myself, what I realized was that with this technology of smartphones and GPS and all of this becoming extremely cheap, easily available, we spend so much of time, money, resources doing surveys, etc. I mean, same budget. If we could get together a team of people, means you get together a number of logistics supply providers who are willing partners. You have perhaps NGOs and research institutes like CARTS and Unnan Shamanwaya coming together to provide a backend for this, and you essentially distribute these devices and create a control tower, develop an application which costs less than $10,000 in today's world, and you start measuring all of these things. So a large number of the parameters that are identified in the paper that I have you can actually have a real-time data tower that captures all of this, and the insights that come out of it will give you a very rich information about what the real challenges are. Some of them will still require some kind of survey. For example, extent of damage or loss or costs, for example, you still need to have a logisticians or user survey. But if you develop this app and you develop this willing, the coalition of the willing, to use a much abused word, of logistics supply providers backed by business associations and research groups, you will have that. And you can use that very same app to replicate these surveys with much reduced marginal cost than you do today. So if we can, all of us, at least a subset of us can come together and do this, then in my mind, we'll leave a lasting legacy of doing very micro level good analysis and research for the corridors that we have. And BBIN, in my mind, is an excellent place to start, because this is a region where you have a lot of new infrastructure coming up. And over the years, as this new infrastructure goes live, whether it's inland waterways or new roads or a through rail between West Bengal and Northeast India transiting to Bangladesh, you will be able to then capture the real impact of this infrastructure using the same structure that you have put together. And that will give you a great sense of the bang for the buck that you have for this kind of new infrastructure as well for regional integration. So I will end there. I know it's a little bit of a all over the place idea, but I'm glad that I have such a distinguished panelists, with people much more experienced than me, to chastise me and correct me and tell me, the foolishness that I've indulged in, and perhaps guide me in the right direction and guide all of us in the right direction. So with those words, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pritam. All of us are aware that whenever we introduce any new concept, there will be some resistance, but nevertheless, we'll see how to take it forward. And I also have some questions or comments or clarifications which I'll keep for myself toward the end of this program. But before that, let me come to our panel. First, I would request Cecile, and I have a couple of set of questions for you, Cecile. First is about your overall opinion on this approach. And related to that is, do you think that this kind of a corridor-wise assessment from origin to destination can help improve overall logistics quality? And how can this new approach facilitate stronger regional integration and add to the One South Asia concept of the World Bank Group? So over to you, Cecile, in about 12 to 15 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much, BIPUL, and thank you, Pritam, for that presentation. There was a lot of richness in the presentation and some nuances that I hadn't picked up in the paper, so that was very, very helpful. Thank you also for the invitation to be here today. Let me just start by repeating a few things that BIPUL said and putting this in context, because I do think that understanding the magnitude of the challenge helps us then get to better solutions. So we do know that interregional trade accounts for barely 5% of South Asia's total trade. So BIPUL says that in itself is not the problem, and I agree. But if you compare it to other nations such as Southeast Asia, so ASEAN, where it's 25%, you understand the potential gains of improving trade in the region. And those gains are in terms of growth, in terms of prosperity, and poverty reduction. So there's a real benefit to improving trade in the region. The second fact is we know that bilateral trade between Bangladesh and India represents 10% of Bangladesh's trade and only 1% of India's trade. And we also know that vehicles from each of these countries are banned from plying the roads of the other. So the vehicles stay at the border, and that's a huge cost. And then the third fact I want to bring to the conversation is that it's about 15 to 20% less expensive for a company in India to trade with a company in Brazil, as we mentioned earlier, or Germany than a company in Bangladesh. So I think that's just a stark reminder of the magnitude of the challenge and the reason why for us at the World Bank, and I think for everyone on this panel today and the audience, improving trade policy, trade facilitation, and logistics in South Asia is of such critical importance. And logistics in particular, because we do know that supply chains are only as strong as their weakest link. So where things break down, all trade halts. So I read this paper with great interest, and I have to say that from a World Bank perspective, we think that this is very, very welcome. That these corridor-wide assessments, which leverage big data and new technologies, and introduce this concept of fluidity, are something that we can be fully behind. Gathering corridor-level data is essential to inform policymaking. This is actually an area where we at the World Bank have done quite a lot of research and have developed some experience over the years. In 2014, we issued a trade and transport corridor management toolkit that puts emphasis on using automated data sources for corridor performance assessment and diagnostics. We've had a number of corridor projects in multiple regions of the world, and in many of these, we have started to use big data analytics to identify operational and procedural bottlenecks. So to get to the core of the problem, as Pritam was explaining, but also and importantly to increase accountability and transparency and also efficiency of the investment planning and the policymaking along these corridors. So let me just take a moment to talk about the various data sources. So PRITAM explained that we do actually have quite a wealth of data on logistics and connectivity. And in my view, these are actually quite complementary. So if we look at the Logistics Performance Index, for instance, we fully agree that it does not provide the granular data that is needed to make investment decisions in specific corridors. However, I think the LPI is a great complement to the type of approach that PRITAM introduces. First of all, it is internationally recognized and it's been an influential global benchmark since 2007, and it's gone through a number of iterations and refinements over time. Secondly, we know that it's being used quite extensively as a key performance indicator to stimulate action and track progress of national connectivity strategies in countries such as Indonesia, Vietnam, and Morocco. And also because it allows for useful comparisons across countries and over time. At the World Bank, we're actually in the process of updating LPI and moving towards LPI 2.0, which will leverage much more automated and big data than we have in the past. The reason we're able to do so is that many of the logistics operators today track shipments and vessels, that border transactions are now recorded by ports and customs, and that these big data sheets embody detailed information on firms, on international trade and economic trends. So a lot of that big data is already embedded in the systems and processes and made available. So the LPI 2.1 will help estimate the quality of supply chain connectivity from tracking information and will generate statistics of supply chain lead time. So in a way, what we're seeing is that these tools are very complementary, but they're also converging in some way by the use of this big data. So big data will change the world of logistics. I want to highlight three challenges that we see to corridor benchmarking and monitoring. Just three things for all of us to keep in mind as we progress in implementing some of these approaches. The first is financial sustainability. Implementing such a corridor monitoring mechanism requires carefully identifying a clear revenue stream beyond the initial support from government or international organizations, and then designing value-added services that shippers will be willing to pay for. In our experience, this is not always the case. And I'll give you an example of a bank-supported effort which tried to develop a GPS-based corridor monitoring platform and a trucker monitoring system in Southern Africa that today is non-operational. Though it entailed a low initial capital investment, operation and maintenance costs became too high to sustain. Another challenge for us to consider is the institutional mechanisms for corridor monitoring. And here I'll share two positive examples. The first is the Northern Corridor in Kenya and the Abidjan-Lagos Corridor Organization that the World Bank has supported, which have been successful examples in corridor monitoring because they have benefited from strong institutional support and frameworks. And then the third, and the not a negligible one, is data sharing. So what PRITAM proposes does rely, as you were saying, on a coalition of the willing to make the data available and to share it widely. And we know that that can be a sensitive issue, particularly in South Asia. So it would require cooperation, agreements, and maybe even formal agreements between BBIN governments in order to share this data, and obviously with the operators themselves. So in sum, we see that this approach is very relevant, very timely for South Asia, and it does supplement other data collection efforts and seems to be very much aligned with some of the experiences we're seeing in other countries. So BIPUL, you also asked how this helps in our own thinking at the World Bank on our One South Asia concept. So let me talk about that very briefly. I actually am quite new to this job. I joined in March, just before we were all sent home for lockdown. And I spent with my team the first few months in this new job updating our regional integration strategy. The main reason was that we're actually celebrating our 10-year anniversary here at the World Bank, 10 years of supporting countries in their efforts on regional integration cooperation. And also because we wanted to make sure that our approach and our strategy was fit for purpose in times of pandemic, in times of crisis, and that we could leverage regional integration as a tool for the recovery process. Our strategy has three main pillars. The first is economic connectivity, and that covers many of the things we're talking about today. It's trade policy, trade facilitation, logistics, but also energy, transport, and digital connectivity. Our second pillar covers resilience to climate shocks and enhancing, reducing vulnerability. And our third pillar is on human capital. And that, as you can imagine, is very much in response to the pandemic. So trade and trade facilitation are at the heart of our strategy. And we've been doing a lot of work on this over the years, a lot of analytical work, a lot of technical support in countries. But we see that the magnitude of the challenges has not diminished very much over the years, while we also do see willingness to act. So I think what this approach brings is two things. One is we all recognize that in order to spur action in this region, strong analytics and data are absolutely essential. And I think that this approach does bring that. These corridor assessments can be great tools to improve logistics, to improve accountability. But I would also add that they bring a new dimension, right? I think a good corridor assessment can also help assess and incentivize wider economic benefits. And that's something that we've been focusing a lot in our work on economic corridors. So making sure that we're not just building great roads and great logistic systems, but that we are connecting the hinterland, bringing rural areas in, connecting them to markets, focusing in particular on giving women access to markets, supporting small and medium businesses, including women-led businesses. So keeping our eye on inclusion and on sustainability in these corridors is essential. The second reason why we think these corridor assessments can be very useful, and I would say extremely timely today, is that if there's one thing COVID brought to life, it is the importance of digital. That's how we're connected today, and that's how most of us are doing business these days. And we have seen some good initiatives taken just over the past few months in terms of digitizing and automating trade and transport. And we think that there's certainly greater understanding within our government stakeholders and private sector of the importance of doing so. So the time may be right to engage with stakeholders to create this app that PRITAM was discussing, to crowdsource some of this information, get agreements on greater digitization automation. Because we do believe that the more countries automate, the more they digitize, and the more they use the technology that is already available, the more resilient the supply chain can become. So data-driven monitoring will be a huge part of this effort, and we're very pleased to support this effort, and certainly, have some offline conversations on some practical applications that we could pursue together. So with this, I'd like to just conclude again by thanking you, BIPUL and PRITAM, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecile, for placing these thoughts on the table, and we have made a note of them. And I'm particularly glad that you mentioned a number of successful examples of corridor-led regional integration, whether it is Northern Corridor example in Kenya or Abidjan Lagos example. So I have a question for you, and of course you don't have to respond now, you can come later, is that this corridor-led regional integration, this concept is quite new in our part of the world. I'm talking about the BBIN countries. So how can we take this examples, successful examples, lessons from there to our part of the world? That is something I think we need to work on in future. At the same time, within countries, we see that there is corridor-led economic development program which has started. We have this, for example, Delhi-Mumbai freight corridor. We have this East Coast corridor in India. In Bangladesh, we have this Brahmaputra, Jamuna, which is Brahmaputra in India, waterway corridor, then Sylhet-Dhaka corridor. I'm sure there are similar corridors in Nepal as well as in Bhutan. So how can we then connect the dots, including getting the right kind of political will, both at the higher level as well as the local level, is something which is very, very important. So on that note, let me now come to Jan, and there are a couple of questions for you, Jan. One is, of course, that how overseas connectivity can be made more seamless, seeing the immediate need for vaccine movement between different parts of the world. Of course, vaccine movement is nothing new there, but this particular need is very, very important for all of us. Related to that, how can you think that technology be more integrated and data gathering be improved? And secondly, how do you envisage the role of private players and markets in this process? So over to you, Jan, in about 12 to 15 minutes.
With pleasure, and very happy to join you. Thanks so much for this invitation. Yeah, you ask about more the overseas connectivity, because you know that we have worked specifically on maritime and connectivity, but also customs and corridors. So I actually have pulled out some data on the specific port connectivity, but the good news is, for the interest of this topic, that a key way to improve your overseas maritime connectivity actually has to do with the inland intermodal transit connectivity. So I'll come back to this. And as I said, I've pulled out some data from our various sources. We have data on time in port, port calls, fleet deployment from partners, and I want to acknowledge here Marine Traffic, MDS Transmodal. And there actually, please don't shoot the messenger, the news is not so good for the ports of the region. Of course, all 4 countries of the region connect through ports in either India or Bangladesh. So if I look, for example, the median time that a container ship spends in the port in the world, that's 16.6 hours. That's the median time. In Bangladesh, it is 74 hours. So that's like 4.5 times more. That's the median time. I want to make one comment there on the paper by PRITAM, and so I really appreciate it. It's interesting, and have some more thoughts. When you have your table of the possible inputs and data, you at times mention the average. Actually, we have moved more to using the median, meaning the 50% point, because many of these things that we try to measure, be it cost or time or other metrics, they have this statistical distribution with a long tail. And the average is always higher than the median, the 50% point. And if a trader, a user, spends X hours, which may be below the average time, but it may still be above the median time. So he may be happy, but he shouldn't be happy. So that's just more a statistical thing, a suggestion. In general, for our port statistics that we publish, where we say, how long do ships spend in ports? We have decided, when we developed the methodology with marine traffic, for example, to take the median time. So what I'm saying now is the 50% time. What is the normal, typical time a ship would expect to be in port? And as I said, it's 4.5 times longer for a container ship in Bangladesh than the world average. It is in India, it's 1.3 times more, like it's 21 hours compared to the 16.6 world average. And if I say, like, comparison from the region, in Sri Lanka, it is 19 hours. That's container ships, dry bulk ships. There, again, Bangladesh has almost 7 days for a dry bulk carrier, where the average, sorry, now I'm making that mistake. The median of the world is 2 days for dry bulk carriers. So just complementing this with real hard data, and I appreciate the points also made by Celine and others. There is a lot of data out there. The beauty of this data series we have here for container connectivity, we have since 2006. For the time import, we have since 2018. It's hard data. It's really, it's difficult to disagree. You may discuss whether you want to take the median or the average, but that is quite hard data. As I have this data here in front of me, the also not so good news in general is that we can already measure the impact of the pandemic or the number of port calls. Now it's not the efficiency, but it's the number of port calls has gone down. Again, if I take container ships in the world, they have gone down by 3%, so minus 3.2% actually. In Bangladesh, the number of container ship port calls first semester this year compared to first semester last year is 15% down. India, it's 7.8% down. So overall, just giving some examples of hard data, because I think that goes in the line also of the paper where something is suggested about using apps, about using different approaches. I think overall we are on the right track with this. We have more demand for better, more data, more monitoring, including due to COVID. No? Celine also mentioned this. Sorry, Cecile. I have many friendly colleagues who have these names. Cecile mentioned the issue of more demand and the connection to the pandemic. Now, of course, all of a sudden, many people in the past loved to put stamps on papers and have personal contact, realize it's actually not such a good thing. We should digitalize more. So we have more demand for digital solutions, and we also have better technologies, more data available, be it ASICUDA, be it AIS systems, be it cargo tracking. There are many things. I'm not an expert in the development on apps, but when PRITAM writes, you can develop a certain application for $30,000, I believe it's very likely true. So there was some data I wanted to share. I'm happy to share more. All this is now public on our website. We have a lot of data on maritime on UNCTAD website. On this first, on these overseas and connectivity, also another source of data is what do the countries actually request from the WTO? Because, you know, under the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, countries, where they put measures under categories A, B, C. C is the one where you think you need technical assistance. There are 37 measures in the agreement, the Trade Facilitation Agreement in 12 articles. So Bangladesh, for example, has specifically requested assistance already some time ago for risk management, perishable goods, and transit. And I think these seem to be very valid also in terms of the questions that people asked about what needs to be done now in terms of overseas connectivity. Then you asked about technology to be more integrated, data gathering, and so on. I must say that there are a lot of initiatives out there, and PRITAM did mention them, or did mention that there are many, but you don't really refer to all of them. I think it would be good to have like one more paragraph in the paper or for the awareness that there are already some initiatives out there, like the SCAP 2016 study, which is more in Eastern Asia, but yes, there are something on logistics, information systems, SCAP's readiness assessments for paperless trade. I know they all come from different angles, but I think it would be worth mentioning these, not to reinvent the wheel for some part of it. Of course, we in UNCTAD, we have the ASICUDA World being implemented in a number of countries in the region. My colleagues here, they told me before this meeting, I should make some publicity and promote the agreement on the use of the ports of Chittagong and Mongla for trade from India, which apparently is something useful, which would also help the rolling out of more technology solutions. So I have already said the demand for the technology has gone up during the pandemic. I like to say we need to lock in the progress made during lockdown. So there's more progress made these days. We have a lot of additional requests for our work on single windows, on Asikuda, on trade information portals, electronic payments, digitalization solutions, general port reforms, the different programs in UNCTAD. And if, as we all hope, the pandemic will end not so far away, I think all of us here in this group, we need to make sure to lock in the progress made in lockdown. And one last point on this technology part. I think all of us have seen PowerPoints where somebody presents a balance, a trade-off, something. Either I protect my population or I facilitate trade. And I always get angry. I then try to hold my breath, get red, and strike it through in my PowerPoint. It's the wrong picture. There's not a single measure in the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. There's nothing in the World Customs Organization recommendations or CFACT or in the 10-point action plan we published at UNCTAD that would not help both. If you have a good risk management, you have pre-arrival processing, you have single windows, you have more transparency, you have electronic payments, whatever, it all helps achieve both. Protect our population, transport worker, customs officers from whatever misdeclarations, false good, and facilitates trade. Because nobody is saying you should not control it, just make it more efficiently. So that leads me to the third question BIPUL asked, third and last, on the role of private players and markets also. You know, which is the port that is most important, the seaport, most important seaport for German cargo? I'm originally from Germany, so I know that. It's Rotterdam in the Netherlands. The most important port for Polish seaborne trade is Hamburg in Germany. The most important port for French cargo is Antwerp in Belgium. The most important port for Norwegian cargo is Gothenburg in Sweden. What am I trying to say? You have open borders, you have functioning transit systems, you have open transport markets. And that is where I come back where I started. In intermodal transit connectivity actually helps the maritime connectivity because it opens more choices, more competition. That's really important. By the same token, on this very last question on the private sector markets, you know that on quite a few routes in the region, cargo is still loaded, unloaded, and our truck drivers cannot go through. You don't really have a common land transport market, which is something that the European Union functions very well. It has led to a lot of efficiency improvements. And last point on this private sector markets, you know, in UNCTAD, we put a lot of our work in the NTFCs, National Trade Facilitation Committees. And I was myself privileged in 2012. I've been to Bhutan, to Nepal, to Bangladesh, trying to help create, strengthen, modernize the NTFCs in the countries. And it doesn't sound too exciting. What is the solution to all these big problems we are monitoring with all this data? It's a committee. Wow, that sounds another meeting, another committee. But what's the alternative? You need some mechanism where you get the private sector, the public sector. But also within the private sector, there may be the users and the providers. You may have customs brokers who are very happy with the inefficiencies because you need them more, and others not. There may be private sector who does not want to have competition from abroad. So it's not just private public, but it is also between finance and trade and economic planning. So these need to get together, and that would be another story. I would be happy to support this. So if I may somehow conclude this approach, three last thoughts. The best model of a cat is a cat. You may have heard this. So I have a little bit the feeling in what PRITAM is proposing. It can be very, very detailed. I would agree with CECILE that there's also value in some more macro things like time series comparable, because the more you go in detail, the more difficult it is to keep things updated. I think the second point is, yeah, there's a closing gap in terms of more demand and also more possibilities. And in that sense, yeah, working towards hard data, maybe learn from the maritime part where we have the satellite AIS data. I think in that direction, take Google Maps, take other cargo tracking. I think we're on the right track, and I think this event and this paper are very helpful in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. You have made a number of very, very important points and observations. I would just highlight 2 or 3 of them. First is that there is absolutely no denying of the fact that we have to digitize and digitize first. And there is also support from bodies like UNCTAD, World Bank, ADB. At the same time, you have to also take into account the local political economic considerations. And as you have rightly said, if I look at it carefully, then it's really not much of a trade-off. It's a positive sum game that we are talking about. But here comes the importance of organizations like us to talk about such things with the local stakeholders in particular and take their views forward at various levels of the government and other agencies who are involved. So this is something which we are doing, and this is something which we will continue to do while taking such initiatives forward. And the second point, which I think very important that you have made, you have mentioned all these ports in Europe, be it Rotterdam, be it Hamburg, and other such ports. And they are good examples that we should take lessons from there. Unfortunately, we are in that thinking has started taking place in our establishment. There's a place called Sahibganj in India, which is in a state in Jharkhand, right on the river Ganga. This is an ideal location for a multimodal logistic initiative, and that has started. And the establishment here is thinking about developing it like the Rotterdam port. It can serve cargoes from Nepal, from Bhutan, from Bangladesh, and of course from India, to various other parts of India, I would say, more prosperous parts of India. So that is something which we need to keep in mind. So on that note, let me now come to KUANCHENG from the Asian Development Bank. So KUANCHENG, couple of questions for you. First is, what is your opinion about the current status of corridor fluidity in the BBIN sub-region? How do you improve that? Including the quality of available associated logistic services to facilitate higher corridor fluidity in this sub-region. And the second one is, and this is important, in the absence of quality data, first data and then quality data, which is a huge challenge in our part of the world. What do you think about what kind of parameters that can be used to have a better sense about corridor fluidity in the BBIN sub-region, and how to integrate this new concept in the BBIN and or SASEC transport planning model? So over to you, KUANCHENG, in about 12 to 15 minutes, your thoughts.
Okay, thank you, BIPUL. And thank you for inviting ADB to join this meaningful event. The presentation by PRITAM was very interesting and insightful. Also, well, thank the other 2 panelists, CECILE and Jan's wonderful sharing. For the first question about the current status of a corridor fluidity in the BBIN sub-region, as well as how to improve the logistic quality service level, I have 3 viewpoints to be shared. First of all, let's begin with the nature and the characteristics of the logistic industry. For manufacturing industries, small and medium enterprise can be competitive even globally. But for logistics, big company do enjoy huge advantages. Economy of scale is a huge factor, whilst variable cost is usually nominal. Unit cost can be greatly reduced for large shipping volumes. Also, economy of scope is also crucial. but given various kind of logistic activities, warehousing, packaging, trucking, custom clearance, etc., are involved in the different stages of the supply chain and among different supply chain players. So for the case of India, logistics is an industry more than 200 billion and accounting for 14% of GDP. Well, this is a big industry. And but this 14% suggests there's a significant room for improvement. The number for the United States is roughly 8%. There are quite a lot of reasons behind this number, 14%. I would like to highlight one critical fact, just one fact. The logistic industry in the BBIN region is very fragmented. We see we seen small trucks running around. We see small warehouses scattered everywhere. That's the logistic performance in terms of all the dimension PRITAM mentioned. The transit time, cost, reliability, and the resilience is unlikely to be good. However, I am not suggesting that the public sectors or big XOEs are encouraged to deeply get involved in providing logistics services. I just want to share two concepts. First of all, is multimodal transport connectivity. The second one is private sector participation. That this can be best illustrated by the following example in India. In 2017, the government of India launched a program to develop 35 multimodal logistic parks, MMLP, across the country. ADB, as a lead partner, and supported a pre-feasibility study for 2 MMLP locations, one in Karnataka and the other in Assam. So why we have to talk about multimodal connectivity? Roads has been a dominating mode in the BBIN region. However, we understand that the rail on water transport, inland waterways, cost of shipping are cheaper in terms of unit cost, and a lot of more environment friendly. But then nonetheless, due to the lack of total accessibility, this mode need integrated logistic facilities. These facilities are crucial for seamless flow of goods. Based on ADB's pre-feasibility study, a framework of effective multimodal logistics facility should include a very smooth transfer between modes, one-stop shopping for various logistics services, freight consolidation. This is crucial for SMEs to enjoy low unit cost, and the value-adding activities and the application and introduction of technologies. So all these 5 features are very helpful to improve the quality and reducing the cost of logistic services. So then the second one, how to facilitate the private sector participation. Private companies are very good at cost control, customer-centered services, but they need some fundamental support from public sectors. We need a good institutional arrangement or good models, which depends on the development, operation, maintenance responsibility of the players, given the consideration over risk and efficiency. For example, we can choose a PPP model, public-private partnership model, in which the development and the operation of the logistic part is undertaken by the third parties. Whereas the nodal agency, the government agency, provide the land and collect the lease rental. And alternatively, we also can have the nodal agent as the master developer, who develop and operate the common infrastructure and amenities, and allow individual third-party players to develop and operate the facilities. So the revenue in this case is collected in the form of lease rental or even revenue sharing. Okay, so there are all kinds of financial arrangement to facilitate the collaboration between public and private partners. But of course, government need to do many others more, such as handling the physical bottlenecks, which you need a lot of investment for infrastructure, or to deal with the regulatory bottlenecks. But I would like to conclude my response to the first question raised by BIPUL by highlighting one bottom line. It's about the role of governments. The government should build a good business environment and be an incubator. And then the private sectors will reward our society with these expensive high quality logistic services. And hopefully there will be a time, there's a good chance that the government needed to play a bigger role as a regulator. Because monopoly, natural monopoly is inherent to logistics. And we have to find a balance about consumer protection, shipper protection, and the laborers. Okay, that's what my response to the first question. Yeah. So about the second question, in the absence of quality data, what parameters can be used to have a better sense about corridor fluidity in the BBIN region? This is a very difficult question. And frankly speaking, we probably can do very little if there's no data at all. So, but as highlighted by PRITAM, the idea that objective end-to-end real data can be very helpful for us to evaluate and improve logistic services. So I think we should begin with some pilot testing. Nowadays, tracking technologies as well as data analytics are relatively mature and not that expensive. Like what we have done for COVID-19, we have QR code, APPs, and the cloud platform. So I think a pilot test does not cost as much, but the real challenge is about how we coordinate the supply chain players to jointly identify the bottlenecks and then take action upon together. So I think that's the real challenge. And of course, once we have done some pilot testing, we can try something a bit formal. And what I would like to share is the case for CARAC. For years, ADB has been supporting to implement the CPMM, corridor performance measurement and the monitoring for all 6 corridors within CARAC. And we perform an analysis according to, based on the mechanism, based on the measurement and monitoring. We have annual reports for past 10 years. So I think that's something that the experience we can share. And we have to revisit the 3 challenges that CECILE just mentioned about financial sustainability. I have no idea how much money we have spent, but based on my knowledge, we haven't generated, or maybe we have tried, but I'm not sure we have generated any commercial viable product, value-adding services to share the cost. I'm not that sure. And of course, the data sharing is very important, but thanks to the regional cooperation entity, CARAC has been very effective to convince and to coordinate the member countries to follow the mechanism. Okay. The last point I want to mention is that instead of collecting real corridor data, we can also try to make use of some modeling techniques to generate the quantitative result. Okay, that's probably the 5th method in addition to the 4 highlighted by PRITAM. ADB is conducting a technical assistance program to implement a strategic transport planning model, which cover multiple sub-regions, CARAC, GMS, SUCCECT, and multiple mode, road, rail, maritime, inland transport. The key output of the model is to simulate the flow in the networks based on the input of infrastructure and some social and economic assumptions, forecasting. And then, but of course, when doing so, we still need some actual flow to calibrate the model. Or simply speaking, we need to determine the value of the parameters in the model. But if the model is reliable, well, because the simulated flow are very close to the actual flow, yeah, we can synthesize and estimate the generalized cost or the impedance, which is actually the inverse of fluidity of each transport link and for each OD path. We have just received the final report from the consultant, and we will launch the website to share the result and to do some follow-up project to make the most out of this pilot version model. Okay, thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you, KUANCHENG. There are a number of questions which have come. 3 of them are from PRITAM. Then I can see that there are a couple of questions from Yan. One of them is from Sham Dahal from, if I remember correctly, he is from ADB's resident mission in Nepal. So before I request Pritam and other panelists to respond to those questions, I just wanted to highlight one point, which is that we have to look at all these initiatives and see how we can join the dots. I'm sure that there are two things which we need to make note of. One is that there is cost for both the hard and soft infrastructure. At the same time, as all of you have pointed out, highlighted, there are benefits. There are benefits to our private sector, there are benefits to consumers. But somehow I have a feeling that while all of you, ADB, UNCTAD, World Bank, you are doing cost benefit analysis, but we are yet to come across specific numbers which will be useful for us, organizations like us, to take them forward, to policymakers to convince them, and to politicians to convince them that look, there are benefits and benefits for your people. So on that note, let me first Shyamji is ADB's technical trade facilitation consultant in Nepal. So I stand corrected. On that note, let me first come to Pritam. Pritam, there are 2 or 3 questions for you. If you can respond to them quickly. We have to close this session. This is very, very interesting. And normally I don't attend webinars towards the end of a day. But let me first come to Pritam. If you can respond to those questions quickly. Over to you. There is one from Purushottam Ojha, from former Commerce Secretary of Nepal. Then there is one from
Yeah, I have looked at
Afsar Alam.
Right. So I think the broad theme of questions over here relate to the advantages of multimodal connectivity and competition between the modes, and the other question is related to active private player participation and how this can help. I think those questions have been broadly, I think the answer is, an emphatic yes on both counts. You would want multimodal competition, that and not just multimodal competition, as Jan was rightly pointing out, your move of any product between origin and destination is multimodal. It always is. I mean, your last and first mile typically would always be by road, and it will go on to some other mode, and sometimes you'll have 3 modes involved. So it's not just about competition, it's also about having an integrated multimodal and having that effective transfer points, the ability to do all of that. And I think in terms of having the point about private sector participation is essential, because over a period of time, you wouldn't want a government monopoly to run any kind of logistic services. But besides those 2 questions, what I would like to broadly address is 2 points. One is in response to what KUANCHENG said about modeling as a 5th approach, and largely speaking also on what Jan was mentioning. So in terms of, rightly pointed out, the BBIN motor vehicles agreement, which was potentially going to create this seamless movement of trucks, is still expected. And this is just one example of where you have what could be seamless connectivity, single mode or multimodal, not happening. There are several initiatives in the pipeline, and as they go live, we'll see to what extent is positive in our region. And in terms of the risk management systems, again, it has to be more comprehensive look at that as well. So just to take Indian example, we have had a customs risk management system in place for almost 2 decades now, and it has improved over a period of time, as any risk management system does. It leverages previous data to become more efficient. But one of the things we are working through ADB with the government of India is that, you have over 60% of your products which require clearance from another agency besides customs, food safety authority or, quarantine authorities. And if they do not also have a risk management system, then something falls between the gaps, because customs clearance is done, but clearance from this partner government agency is still pending. So to that extent, capacity has to be built across stakeholders And once you have that in place, at least for the other 6 or 7 main agencies also having a more modern risk management system, then you will probably start seeing the real benefits. Just last very quick point, I know we are short of time, is that, many of why this micro level, kilometer wise, not to exaggerate, but, going deep down is important, is that sometimes, and as Jan was mentioning, it's the hinterland problem, which really drives many of this. It's about 3 kilometers in a stretch of 200-kilometer road that results in all the congestion. Or, the gate automation in a single port, which results in congestion. So it's really one small thing or a combination of 3 small things. And this is dynamic. So for example, the solution might be that I develop an underpass to bypass that congestion. Well, 2 years down the line, the government develops another industrial cluster which feeds in trucks from another direction, and you have a new congestion point. So this never stops. So while modeling, and I have done some of that myself, is a great idea, and you are right, KUANCHENG, when you say that you will need that, the baseline data to start doing effective modeling in the first place. It also has to be an iterative process, because what I model today, especially in the Indian context, which is a developing country which is doing infrastructure of all kinds very fast, you will see your reality has shifted in 3 or 4 years' time. So we have to keep these things in mind, and that's why it's so important. And I really like Cecile's comment on this, that it's a combination of all this. It's not suggesting that one of them is better than the other. It's like we have to use all these tools and see how best we can analyze the problems and then find sustainable solutions for them. So thank you again.
Thank you, Pritam. Before I come to Jan, there is a question, Pritam, for you from Dr. Didar Singh, which is how will you implement this idea? I think you have answered it largely. Of course, there is in this short span of time, you won't be able to answer it fully. But one thing I would like to add, keeping this question in mind and what you have just said, is that we have to test this model on certain corridors. Maybe we are going to discuss it separately with you, whether it is East Coast Economic Corridor or Delhi-Mumbai Freight Corridor. These are the 2 examples which are coming to my mind, where we need to see how we can test this model. So on that note, let me come to Jan. I have forwarded you, there are 2 or 3 questions for you. One is from Mr. Dahal from Nepal, and the other is from my colleague Sarthak Sukla. Jan, if you can address those questions in about 5 minutes. Over to you.
Yeah, no, with pleasure, I can give it a try. The whole topic of national trade facilitation committees. UNCTAD, we have worked for decades on this, including in the region, in Nepal, also Pakistan, Afghanistan, and many African. And I must say, the perfect case study where we say that's now the model for everybody, we are not aware of it, because every country's situation is different. There's so much institutional instability. People change, unfortunately, far too often. We have some good practices, some recommendations. But overall, we do see improvement, and I'm optimistic that we will be getting there. In the past, we only had the carrot. We only had like the trying to convince it's good for you, you need it. And I hope I'm preaching to the converted here. We now have 2 additional allies to overcome vested interest, opposition, laziness maybe. The first ally, apart from the carrot, we now have the stick. Countries that are members of the WTO are obliged to have an NTFC. Now, although this is relatively easy to comply with just to have one, it does help, it raises the profile and so on. The third trend in the positive direction leads back to what we discussed earlier. There is more and more data available, there are more and more tools available, and this allows us who work in the committees and the secretariats to have something to eat, to meet, to chew. for example, in several countries, we combine our work on trade information portals, and sometimes even also single windows, with the NTFC. The NTFC already has normally functioning mechanism and representation of all relevant stakeholders. So you don't want to have parallel mechanisms where all these stakeholders are there. And this then allows you to also assign responsibilities, ownership, because especially say a single window or a trade information portal, an inquiry point, it's never only customs. There are also the quarantine, there are others who are needed, who are involved. So with this, these are some positive trends, good practices. Also the partnership between the different stakeholders, maybe if I've like less than 1 minute, we also learn from our mistakes. We once had a very successful launch of AFPRO in Afghanistan, with the personal signature and press conference of President Karzai at that moment, and elections of the 3 chairs of the committee. One was the DG Customs, one was the president of the Chamber of Commerce, private sector, and the third one was the relevant director of the Ministry of Commerce. So these, and then you would rotate. Every 6 months, one of them has the responsibility. And that is, I think, a good practice, because then everybody who is then for 6 months the chair has some motivation, wants to do the right thing, doesn't want to let it die under his or her leadership. So we had elections, democracy, and put papers in a ballot, and they were elected as 3 people. After 2 weeks, government changed the director of trade. 4 weeks later, DG Custom was changed, and 6 months later, and we stupid had put names on the institutional framework. No, you have to put function. You have to say, it is the director of that department, not Mr. So-and-so. Yeah, that was our mistake. Anyhow, I have many stories of things that can go wrong. I think we are going in the right direction. I would be happy to connect you also to our program. We have an empowerment program. The empowerment program for national trade facilitation committees empowers the individual members, but also the institution. So that's 2 parallel streams, with a capacity building, with an advisory. And if you link this to some real work, like maintaining, updating the trade information portals, for example. Now, I want one last thing, 20 seconds. My favorite article in the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement is Article 10.1, because that is the only article that will still be relevant in 100 years from now. All the other articles, you will at some point in time have ticked off. You will say, yes, category A, ticked off, I have advanced ruling. Ticked off, I have an inquiry point. Ticked off, I have a single window. Article 10.1 obliges all of us to continuously review, revise, improve, always choose the least disturbing solution for trade and so on. So for this, you will also, still in 100 years, there will always be potential for further improvement. There will always be need for trade information portals that monitor the steps that are needed for all the import-export procedures, and in a mechanism with many institutions to monitor and implement Article 10.1.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you for underlining this article. Of course, we have to continuously improve, and that's something we have to imbibe in our system, which we are doing, but more is needed. I'm also glad that you have said that we have to learn from mistakes, and that is very, very important. I think it's a mistake when we talk about best practices. I don't think there is any best practice. It may be best for Kenya, it may not be best for India, but we have to look for good practices. And often we see that best is an enemy of the good. So we have to keep these nuances in mind. And let me also add to what you have said on this, in this importance of institutional mechanism. Other than National Trade Facilitation Committee in India, which is, I think, is working fairly well, we have another institutional mechanism which is port specific. That is called Customs Clearance Facilitation calamities. To begin with, it was for seaports. Now we have made a case why it should be expanded to land ports, and Land Ports Authority of India is looking into it. In some cases, they have started. And why I'm saying this, many of these challenges, issues, I don't want to use the word problem, they are port specific. And they can be resolved at the local level. You don't have to come to capital to resolve them. They can be resolved at the local level. And when you talk about land ports in particular, which is prevalent very much in our part of the world, in this sub-region, there are issues on one side of a land port with another side of a land port. And if the port authorities are from both sides, along with the relevant agencies from respective sides, if they can meet regularly from time to time, by regularly I mean, let's say, quarterly, many of these issues can be resolved. We have tested it, this approach, in couple of land ports in India-Nepal border, Kakarvita and Panitanki, Roxol and Birganj. And we have found that many issues have been resolved and trade has become smoother. The ports have become, their operations have become smoother. So these are the good examples which you need to take forward. So on that note, let me come to CECILE. CECILE, going back to my earlier question, how can we take these good examples about corridors or corridor-oriented, corridor-based economic development? Let's say the example of Northern Corridor in Kenya, or as you said, ABIAN, Lagos Corridor. Then there is this East to West Corridor in Namibia to Tanzania, or sorry, West to East. How can we take these examples to our part, to the BBIN sub-region? So over to you, CECILE.
Thank you. Thanks, BIPUL. So I'll address that, and with your permission, I'd like to add a couple of points also to the conversation.
Yeah,
so,
please.
you know, I think that in the space of trade facilitation logistics, while every country is different, every corridor is different, there are a lot of similarities, right? And the fact that also a lot of this is sort of scripted in these international agreements does allow for comparison. And so I'm with you. I also am not a big believer in best practice, but I definitely do believe in good practice and in learning from mistakes. So I think this is an area where there already is quite a lot of knowledge sharing and cooperation going on amongst countries and regions. But it's something that certainly we as World Bank would be willing to help to foster. I think that what this new reality that we live in permits is actually much more knowledge exchange than in the past, right? We can do it at low cost. And so if there's any interest in helping to bring some of these experiences to South Asia through webinars or otherwise, we'd be very happy to engage. We do have, you know, deep experience, and I mentioned some experience in Africa, but obviously we work a lot in Europe and Central Asia. We work a lot with ADB on CAREC, so there's a lot of experience that can be brought forth. I want to make two additional points, just, you know, reflecting on what I heard in this conversation today. I think PRITAM mentioned the MVA, the Motor Vehicle Agreement, and you know, it's obvious for us that you can fix logistics. You can, you know, you can have perfect roads and great logistics. If you don't fix the underlying policies, your trucks will still not be crossing the border, and they'll still have to unload and reload. So we're actually shortly going to put out a report that's called Thrive to Connect. Sorry, Connectivity to Thrive, or let me double check because I don't want to. Connecting to Thrive, there we go. That's the name of the report, Connecting to Thrive, which is an analysis of the MVA and the very substantial benefits that it could bring to BBIN. So we are hopeful that there will be some advances in that space. And then the other point I wanted to make, and this is reflecting on something you said before, where you did talk about political economy and vested interests. And I think that that's something that we just have to always keep in the back of our mind. We can have wonderful corridor assessments, we can have wonderful modeling, we have wonderful data. If we don't go to the underlying factors of why are things working the way they are today? Why are some of these dysfunctional systems allowed to persist? And not only that, but sometimes fueled, is that clearly there are some stakeholders who are benefiting. And so I think that all of our technical work really needs to be overlaid with the political understanding, not just the geopolitics, right? But also the more, governance issues around who are the key stakeholders, who stands to win or to lose from a reform, who will get in the way, because we can come up with great technical solutions and they can flop miserably because we haven't understood that sufficiently. And so really, I think, for me, the takeaway is let's generate excellent data, because data, and Jan was saying this is hard data. You can't debate it. Data is absolutely essential to convince policymakers to build a case for action. But then let's overlay that data with a really deep understanding of what's really going on in the environment, and who stands to lose and who stands to win, and who can we work with to really make these reforms not only happen, but then stick for the longer term. So with that, back to you, BIPUL. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You are absolutely right. We have to have more case studies, stories from the ground. There is data, and behind data there are stories. So you have to get them, highlight them, to take this, to make incremental progress on our agenda. The most beautiful thing which I like about your program is its acronym: Regional Integration, Cooperation and Engagement with government, think tanks, civil society, media, etc., etc. And the acronym is RICE. So, and that is the most beautiful part, in my opinion. So on that note, let me now come to KUANCHENG for his final word. And KUANCHENG, very specifically, as I said in the beginning, that ADB, its transport division, is a knowledge partner of these initiatives, and we are getting a lot of knowledge from our engagement with you in particular. But my question to you, and I would request you to address it very, very briefly: do you get any knowledge from our work? It has to be a two-way process. So over to you, KUANCHENG.
People, well, of course, that it has been a very rewarding working experience to work with CUTS. I think I have reviewed more than 20 documents, and I have quite a few rounds of discussion. And I think in addition, I have shared with what I've learned with my colleagues. So definitely that's a two-way communication. And in particular, I like your grassroots approach. That's somewhere we sitting in the HQ office cannot imagine. And so I think that's certainly a very good learning experience and a very good collaboration between ADB and the CUTS. And well, that's what. And also we approach things, solve the problem with different approaches, like the modeling I'm doing right now is certainly complementing as PRITAM mentioned that the things change very fast. So we cannot imagine that the modeling can be perfect, can do everything, but it's complementary, that we have to deal with the same problem from different aspects. So once again, this is a very good experience. But before concluding my response, I want to emphasize one thing over here is about the cost-benefit analysis you mentioned. That's a required part for any ADB project. We need to do cost-benefit analysis. However, when we talk about digitization and the value, the benefit of data, it grows exponentially. It's not in a linear fashion. So at the beginning, if you perform a cost-benefit analysis, it's invisible because the benefit is very limited and the cost is huge. So we can apply the cost-benefit analysis to convince the government, to convince the stakeholder at some point of the time. But at the beginning, we have to deal with the problem as that we are venture capitals. We are facing a startup. We never challenge the revenue of a startup. We look at its potential, and that's the point I want to emphasize. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me say that we started on time. In fact, we started 1 minute before time and we ended. We are concluding a minute before time. So I think we are efficient. So on that positive note, let me thank all of you for our presenter, panelists, participants, and there are a lot of food for thought which we have gathered from today's webinar. We are going to cook them and get back to you in the new year. I'm sure that the year 2021 will be better than 2020 in every respect. So on that note, season's greetings, Merry Christmas in advance, Happy New Year in advance. Of course, with some of you will be in touch even during this holiday period over email and maybe over phone call and things like that. But definitely we are going to take it forward. All these ideas which we have gathered today, not just today, from this overall work that we are doing on multimodal connectivity. Let me also thank my colleagues for organizing it, digital organization, etc., etc. And we'll be in touch with all of you as we move forward. So on that note, let me conclude. Cordialement, merci beaucoup.